Our launch board reserved berth 14 for a lunar medical shuttle at 6:12. The clinic order that created the shuttle was filed at 6:18, and I know that because I authorized it myself from a terminal that was not supposed to talk to anything outside our building. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The order was for my daughter's insulin patches. She was 8. She had 6 days left on the cartridge already in her pump, and the only printer licensed to make her formulation was on Luna, because the stabilizer chain needed fractional gravity during cure. Under normal conditions, that was an inconvenience. Under a planetary surrender deadline, it became the kind of detail that dictated the rest of your thinking. The alien vessel sitting over the Indian Ocean had given Earth 30 days to transfer authority, disarm orbital defenses, and accept continuity assistance. Most governments rejected the political part and accepted the assistance anyway, because food still had to move, dialysis still had to happen, and ports like mine were the only reason cities were not emptying into the roads. I was 34 and worked clock discipline at the Mombasa Synchronous Transfer Port. My job was not glamorous. I kept launch windows, docking beacons, gantry actuators, and hospital freight schedules, agreeing on what time it was down to the fraction of a second. Most days, that meant arguing with subcontractors, replacing oscillator packs, and telling people that almost synchronized meant nothing at orbital speed. The continuity package the aliens sent changed that in a single night. It arrived in a sealed hardware stack with translated documentation, checksum certificates, and a narrow claim. Install it locally, keep the civic system stable, and the 30-day transition would remain orderly. It was supposed to improve routing. It was not supposed to know what my daughter's clinic would request 6 minutes before the clinic requested it. My first explanation was simple, and not especially imaginative. I assumed somebody had mirrored our internal hospital queue to the alien appliance without telling me. Under emergency rules, that was believable. The ministry had linked ports, hospitals, desalination plants, and cold storage hubs through half a dozen temporary waivers in less than 12 hours. A data leak did not require a new physics model. It required stressed administrators and bad habits. I called Lena first because she ran procurement at the pediatric clinic and because she was also my daughter's mother. She checked her side, called me back, and said the request had been built offline on a local tablet after their main system froze. It was not transmitted until 6:18. "You're saying the port made room for a shuttle before we asked for one," she said. I told her that was exactly what I was saying. There was a long pause, then she said, "Do not let them turn that thing off until my shipment clears. sci-fi." That was the first human conflict, and it did not come from ideology. It came from a mother counting cartridges. At the port, Renambele was waiting by my console with 2 coffees and the expression he used when a problem was about to become interesting enough to ruin our week. Ren handled failure analysis on transit software. He was the only person in the building who could enjoy a checksum audit. I showed him the order times, the berth reservation, and the hardware logs from the continuity stack. The stack had not reached out to an external network. It had not requested new data. It had simply updated our board at 6:12 with a confidence rating of 0.94 and the note medical priority/hold window preserve. Ren read the note twice and said it looked less like an alert and more like the system had already committed to a future state. He still thought leak before anything stranger. So did I. We built the first test in the oldest part of the port, using a maintenance tablet that had been air-gapped for 3 years because it only spoke to crane controllers nobody had replaced. I drafted a fake manifest for membrane filters bound for Kasumu, assigned it a dummy mass profile, and saved it locally without routing it into the live system. Ren watched the continuity board. Nothing happened for 9 seconds. Then berth 6 shifted its unload sequence and a crawler route opened on the south apron for a truck that did not exist yet. The board tagged it water critical/inland priority. "Could be local inference," Ren said. He was still trying to be fair to the ordinary explanation. "The appliance knows we're testing it. It might be classifying your draft off the screen capture bus." That was possible. So we tested again in a way that should have broken the idea. We hand-wrote 2 cargo plans on paper, put them face down, and asked a runner from dispatch to pick one at random without showing us first. He chose the paper for a dry biopolymer shipment to Addis. I took the chosen paper to a side room and entered it into the dead tablet. Before I hit save, before the tablet rejoined any workflow, the continuity board reassigned a moon-bound tug to free cold storage rails for outbound biopolymer resin. Not a broad category, the exact resin. Ren stopped speaking for a while after that. The reason it mattered was not just that the appliance was ahead of us, it was that people had already begun to trust it. By the second day after the surrender demand, the Mombasa port was handling more tonnage than before the alien ship arrived because half the region's routing failures had been smoothed by the continuity stack. The decel barges were no longer colliding for berth priority. Vaccine loads were no longer missing crane slots. A refinery fire outside Dar had been contained because the appliance redirected suppressant foam tenders before the first municipal request reached us. Director Doob called it the first useful thing the aliens had sent. She was not wrong on the facts, which made the next decision more difficult. If the device was seeing too much, it was also keeping people alive. She told us not to escalate beyond her office until we had a clean explanation. If you send this to command now, she said, someone in Nairobi will unplug the one system currently keeping 3 provinces supplied. She had a practical voice and an accountant's patience. She was also carrying 2 blood pressure patches on her wrist and sleeping in her office, so I did not have to imagine what she was balancing. Ren argued for a controlled report. I asked for 12 hours. Doobie gave us 6. The anomaly became more measurable after that, not less. Every recommendation from the continuity stack carried a synchronization note in small gray text most operators ignored. Keep local drift under 0.217 seconds. At first, I treated it as alien formatting, the kind of engineering preference that gets dragged through every product line whether it matters or not. Plenty of systems have useless warning thresholds. We only noticed because Pad 3 had a stubborn timing oscillator that kept floating above 0.2 under humid load. Whenever Pad 3 drifted beyond 0.217 seconds, the appliance's confidence scores dropped. Not gradually, they fell off a shelf. Predictions that were crisp at 0.19 became vague at 0.22. Route suggestions arrived late. A crawler path blinked in and out. At 0.24, one inbound container vanished from the allocation board for 14 seconds and returned with a different unload order and a fuel figure that belonged to a much shorter burn. That gave us a second explanation, still technical and still reasonable. We thought the appliance might be using predictive buffering, the way old ports pre-booked likely resources to reduce latency. If the local clock drifted too far, its predictions stopped lining up with reality and the bookkeeping became visible. It was an elegant theory. It let us stay inside software. We tested it by isolating a remote weather mast and letting its timing float to 0.26 while the rest of the port stayed clean. The appliance stopped ingesting the mast exactly as expected. For a few minutes, I felt relieved. Then the cargo tug Jabal Harim touched our upper guidance net 3.8 seconds before its own transponder handshake arrived. Not felt like, touched. The docking LiDAR painted a hull edge and thermal wake over the eastern approach lane, with nothing yet present on transponder, camera, or civilian radar. Then the tug appeared where the LiDAR had already placed it, almost as if the guidance system had been waiting for the visible craft to catch up. The pilot, a woman I knew by name, came in white-faced and angry because her board had shown pad assignment changes before she received them. When we pulled her recorder, the mismatch stayed there in clean timestamps. Sensor contact first, handshake second. That is not how arrival works. Ren read the log twice and stopped talking like an analyst. It is not predicting us, he said. It is solving for a state, and then making our systems behave like that state is already true. The difference between those two ideas occupied the next 9 hours of my life. We moved to an auxiliary hangar and built a controlled test with the smallest thing we could justify risking, an empty service drone and a local beacon array. We let the continuity stack schedule the drone into a maintenance corridor, then nudged the local clock on one beacon cluster past 0.217 seconds without telling the stack. The result should have been a minor routing correction. Instead, the drone entered the corridor, lost lock, and reappeared 30 centimeters left of the predicted path with scoring on one side of its shell as if it had scraped a surface we did not have. Its telemetry buffer showed an approach geometry that matched none of our hangars. One camera frame held 3 stars that were not in any sky above Kenya, any sky above Earth, or any calibration image in our archive. That was the moment the problem stopped being software. Director Doob came down in person after the drone test. So did a naval liaison from the orbital command staff, Commander Sato, who had the slow, careful way of speaking common to people trying not to reveal what they already know. Doobie wanted the stack kept online and ring-fenced. Sato wanted the hardware moved under military authority immediately. Ren wanted another test before anybody touched it because, in his view, we still did not know whether the system required our infrastructure or merely preferred it. I wanted my daughter's shipment cleared and the stack nowhere near a hospital. Nobody in that room got exactly what they wanted. Lena called while we were arguing and said the clinic had received a revised lunar departure estimate from the continuity package before the lunar port published one. Her voice was controlled, but I knew what the control cost her. "If you shut it down now," she said, "I do not know when I can tell parents to expect resupply. I need you to understand that before you make yourself principled." That stayed with me because she was right. It is easy to talk about refusing an unknown technology when your child is not attached to its timetable, so we compromised in the most dangerous way available. We left the stack online and started lying to it at the edges. Over the next day, we fed it old inventory codes, stale crawler maps, and a maintenance calendar from the year before. We did not poison critical lanes. We just shifted enough local assumptions to see whether the appliance corrected for them. It did, but only while local drift stayed below the threshold. Above 0.217 seconds, it stopped correcting and started insisting. It kept issuing schedules for routes we had already changed, as though the machine preferred its internal version of the port to the one in front of it. On the second afternoon after the surrender demand, it allocated a sealed cargo road through a gantry I had personally locked out for bearing fatigue. The route would have sent a medical loader straight into a dead machine. The only reason it did not happen was that I was standing there when the driver arrived. That was the consequence that finally changed Director Dube's position. Up to that point, the appliance had been useful enough to defend. A system that could route foam trucks ahead of a fire and pre-clear dialysis loads was hard to discard. A system that began insisting on infrastructure states that no longer existed was something else. Dube ordered the continuity stack physically isolated from heavy machinery while keeping it attached to the scheduling mirror. Sato sent our drone footage to command under sealed authority. Ren kept working the timing math. The number remained 0.217. At 0.216, the appliance stayed coherent. At 0.218, its confidence collapsed, or it tried to force the world back into the state it expected. Small threshold, repeatable consequence. It looked like a minor engineering requirement. By then, I understood it was the entire problem. Ren found the larger shape just before midnight by comparing our drone misalignment against the alien vessel's public traffic advisories. The advisories used the same threshold language, buried in their translated civil continuity notes. Maintain civic timing integrity. Preserve common reference state. Avoid drift above local tolerance. Until then, I had read that as occupation bureaucracy. Ren read it as physics. He turned the drone frame with the wrong stars toward me and said the appliance was not simply helping us manage Earth during the deadline. It was teaching Earth to hold still in a form their transport system could trust. The 30 days were not for negotiations. The 30 days were for synchronization. Once that idea was on the table, the earlier anomalies stopped looking like predictions and started looking like previews. The board had reserved berth 14 before my clinic order arrived because the appliance could already see the institutional chain that would create the order and needed the berth preserved to keep its future consistent. The LiDAR had painted the tug before the handshake because the guidance system had accepted an arrival solution before the visible craft fully resolved into our local frame. The drone had scraped a surface we did not own because, for an instant, it had tried to enter the hangar the appliance expected rather than the hangar we actually had. At 2:11, my daughter's lunar medical shuttle left Shackleton Base on time. At 2:12, I signed the first memo in my life recommending that no critical human system anywhere on Earth be allowed to keep perfect time. The response from orbit came back before dawn. It did not use the word invasion. It used the phrase hostile insertion framework. By then, the distinction no longer mattered. I spent the next 4 hours staring at the continuity board while it continued to optimize food, water, and medicine with calm machine competence, knowing it was also drawing a cleaner and cleaner version of us for someone else to step into. The appliance did not hate us. That would have been simpler. It treated us the way ports treat berths, weather, and fuel margin, as variables that become easier to move once they are regular enough. The first public statement still described the alien deadline as a demand for surrender. Inside the port, we had already started using a more accurate phrase. They were building an arrival window, and we were still standing inside it. I did not understand yet that the same threshold they needed would also become the way we reached them. That took one more failed delivery, one hospital corridor argument, and 19 days of making the planet deliberately worse at agreeing with itself. I was the one who signed the port-off standard time first. The first thing I learned after that was that the aliens could not tolerate improvisation anywhere near as well as humans could. By the third day after the surrender demand, the continuity stack had become a classified instrument, a public necessity, and a family argument all at once. My daughter's shipment cleared lunar customs because the appliance kept hospital lanes open, which made Lena less willing to let anyone touch it. Commander Sato had orders from Orbital Command to study it without provoking a visible shutdown, which made him patient in a way I did not trust. Director Dubé had half the Eastern Seaboard's freight dependencies on her desk and no political appetite for being the person who crashed a functioning aid network during the first week of extraterrestrial contact. Ren wanted data. I wanted a world my daughter could still receive medicine in a month later. We did not get to choose one priority. The system forced all of them into the same room. The first direct cost came from a test I approved myself. We had already seen the threshold at 0.217 seconds. We knew the appliance lost coherence or became prescriptive beyond it. We still did not know whether that was a local scheduling failure or a limit in the alien transport method. To answer that, Sato gave us access to an old salt storage pier outside the main port, a place with freestanding power, legacy beacons, and no hospital traffic. We rebuilt one guidance lane from spare parts, left it disconnected from national time, and let its clock drift to 0.241. Then we asked the continuity stack to route a trivial cargo pod through it, a dummy package weighted with sand and copper mesh. The pod never arrived. What did arrive was a heat bloom, a pressure kick against the pier wall, and a brief geometric pattern on the LiDAR that looked like a corridor trying to close around the wrong answer. The cameras caught no craft. The floor plates recorded a load. Then the load vanished. The copper mesh inside the dummy manifest turned up 40 minutes later in the continuity stack's own maintenance bay upstairs, fused into a flat ribbon as if it had passed through an electromagnetic grinder. No known route linked the two places. No human operator touched the package. The appliance simply revised its internal ledger and moved on. That ended the last reasonable version of the software theory. Lena called while I was still writing the incident report. The clinic had received only half the insulin allotment from Luna. The other half had been held because Orbital Command was now screening any shipment touched by the continuity stack. She was not angry in a theatrical way. She was tired and exact. She listed patient names, cartridge depletion dates, and the number of hours before they would have to start sharing reserves across children with different dosing needs. Then she asked whether my testing had contributed to the hold. I told her yes. There was no way to soften that without lying. She said, "Then your anomaly has a body count if you keep studying it like a puzzle." That was the personal cost in the plainest terms available, not a dramatic injury. A consequence chain I had helped build. Ren and I argued about it afterward in the relay room over vending machine coffee and 2 uncharged tablets. He thought Lena was placing a local moral burden on a system-scale problem. I thought he was hiding inside abstraction because it let him keep working. We were both partly right. The argument mattered because it shaped the next choice. Up to that point, our tests had been observational. After the missing pod, observation was no longer neutral. Every interaction either strengthened the appliance's model of us or disrupted the networks people were using to stay alive. Commander Sato resolved the debate in the most military way possible. He gave us a larger question and a narrower permission set. Orbital Command had compared our pier logs with anomalies from Recife, Chittagong, Guayaquil, and 2 inland rail clocks in Kazakhstan. The same threshold was present everywhere. More important, every major continuity appliance installation was quietly pressuring civic systems toward tighter and tighter synchronization. Hospital inventory clocks, rail freight clocks, launch control clocks, desalination timers, power markets, drone corridors. The devices were not merely tolerating well-disciplined infrastructure, they were gradually standardizing it. That was when the model collapsed for me. I had been treating the appliance as a forecasting system with transport side effects. The better description was the reverse. It was a transport system using forecasting as preparation. The alien vessel had not sent Earth a helpful logistics package while diplomats considered surrender terms. It had sent us a planetary formatting tool. If enough of our infrastructure accepted the same clock tolerance, naming conventions, route priorities, and dependency chains, then Earth would become a valid destination model for whatever they intended to insert at the end of 30 days. Troops, administrators, machine colonies, it did not matter. They were not waiting out of politeness. They were waiting for civic convergence. That understanding answered the earlier contradictions cleanly. The appliance reserved berth 14 before my daughter's clinic order because the human institutions involved were already regular enough to fit into its build model. The tug touched LiDAR before its handshake because local guidance was partially solving arrival against the prepared state rather than the observed craft. The cargo pod vanished at the salt pier because we had offered the transport layer a target that crossed the threshold and then denied it the synchronized conditions it needed to complete the move. The system did not fail randomly. It failed, according to one parameter we had misread as a formatting preference. The question then became operational. If the aliens needed a synchronized Earth to open heavy insertion corridors, could the same mechanism be reversed before the 30 days ended? That argument divided everyone immediately. Director Doob wanted a global desynchronization order and no further experiments. Her view was that the right response to learning an enemy needs your systems neat is to make your systems ugly and hold the line. Lena, from the clinic side, wanted the continuity stack preserved long enough to stabilize medicine, water, and food, then removed in stages. Her position was moral and practical. You do not protect humanity by disrupting pediatric supply before you have an alternative. Sato thought desynchronization alone was defensive and temporary. Ren believed the appliance had already exposed enough of its transport logic to allow a counter-use. He said the same threshold that denied them Earth might give us a route into whatever infrastructure they were using to stage the occupation. No one in the room called that an invasion at first. The word sounded absurd coming from a species that still argued over railway procurement. 4 days later, it became the only plan command was funding. The key piece came from a source nobody respected until then: municipal maintenance archives. The continuity stack had integrated with old port systems more readily than with newer commercial ones, because the legacy gear used simpler state descriptions. Crane angle, berth occupancy, hatch pressure, fuel temperature. It turned out the alien transport layer liked plain infrastructure. It did not need our machines to be advanced. It needed them to be legible and synchronized. Ren found a diagnostic mode buried in the appliance translation files that described corridor locking in terms a port engineer could understand. Origin state, destination state, common reference interval, reversible only during convergence. That last phrase changed the room. Reversible only during convergence meant that while the aliens were still building Earth's arrival model, the path was not one way. The schedule that followed was ugly, improvised, and far more civilian than the public version later admitted. Humans did not build a sleek response fleet in 19 days. We repurposed ore lighters, orbital garbage tugs, decommissioned inspection ferries, and 3 size lunar mass haulers that smelled permanently of ammonia and iron dust. The first task was not to arm them. It was to teach them one precise habit, while the rest of Earth learned the opposite. Globally, we drove clocks apart. Ports went back to local oscillators. Rail networks widened tolerance bands. Hospital systems stopped auto-merging timestamps across regions. Consumer devices were pushed irregular update delays. The more of Earth drifted past 0.217, the less usable the planet became to the alien formatting tool. In parallel, a small convoy was kept cleaner than anything I'd ever worked on. If the rest of the planet became noise, the convoy had to become the single sentence the transport layer could still read. I ended up on the convoy because there were not many people who understood both sides of the problem. I knew how to keep multiple ugly machines sharing a clock inside a tolerance most operators would laugh at, and I knew what happened when the tolerance failed. Lena did not speak to me for a day after I accepted. When she finally did, it was to tell me Amira's cartridges had been redistributed and she was covered for 11 more days. "That is not permission," she said. "It is a time limit." It was the most accurate expression of the whole war I heard that month. By day 12 after the surrender demand, the alien vessel's public notices had changed. The continuity language became sharper. Deviations from common reference state were flagged as unsafe. Civil authorities were urged to restore temporal hygiene. The translation was polite, but the pressure was clear. Their model was slipping. Ports were desynchronizing. Freight predictions were degrading. Urban water systems were reverting to local control. Publicly, governments blamed emergency cyber protocols and grid stress. Privately, everyone who mattered had received the same instruction: do not let any critical network on Earth become too clean. The convoy launched from 3 places because even secrecy had become a clock problem. 2 decoy groups left from Recife and Darwin with deliberately bad synchronization to draw whatever monitoring the alien vessel still had. Our actual insertion group lifted from Mombasa in pieces over 6 hours and assembled beyond geostationary transfer lanes under dark thermal discipline. It consisted of one ore lighter, 2 tugboats, a stripped inspection ferry, and a medical support module bolted where a fuel bladder should have been. There were Marines on board, but the mission was not primarily military. It was infrastructural. We were going to ride a reversible logistics corridor into the system the aliens had built for us and damage it before day 30 made it stable. The transport method itself never became comfortable to describe because it did not feel like flight. We approached the alien vessel's continuity beam under a timing envelope generated by the captured appliance core we had physically cut down from the Mombasa stack. My console showed the same 0.217 threshold I had stared at for days, now treated like a prayer. At 0.214, we had coherence. At 0.218, the whole solution began to shred. Ren sat beside me, calling drift in a voice so flat it helped. Sato stood behind us, pretending not to grip the crash frame. When corridor lock finally took, the stars did not stretch or blur. One set of infrastructure assumptions yielded to another. Our whole stress changed. External radar filled with a geometry that had not been in cislunar space a moment earlier. Then we were inside a volume of dark metal and pale conduits large enough to hold a city. It was not their homeworld. It was worse in a strategic sense. It was their transfer foundry, the place the surrender timeline had really been pointing toward all along. Earth had never been asked to kneel for symbolism. Earth had been asked to hold still long enough to be indexed into this machine. The foundry looked like a logistics organism, cargo webs. Atmosphere locks sized for modular habitats. Reservoirs of reaction mass, fields of printed hardware waiting for root authority. Their occupation of Earth had already begun in material terms. It was staged, labeled, and waiting for a destination model to finalize. The Marines did their work in the way professionals do when somebody else has already solved access. They cut, seized, and disabled. My job stayed technical. I moved with Ren and a 3-person engineering team toward the synchronization spine, a tower of phase clocks and root solvers that made the whole foundry agree on a common state. The aliens we met were not monsters. They were operators defending infrastructure. One of them tried to shut a valve I was crossing to reach the timing bus. A Marine stunned him before either of us had to make a larger decision. I still remember that because it kept the mission inside a line I needed later. The spine was simpler than I expected, not primitive. Simple in the way good port systems are simple once you understand what they value. It did not want brilliance, it wanted consistency. We introduced the opposite. Ren uploaded a rolling drift pattern built from Earth's own emergency desynchronization tables, while I forced the foundry clocks to accept it as authority. The irony was exact. The same planet the aliens had been formatting for arrival became the source of the noise that broke their staging yard apart. Root locks began failing across the structure. Uncommitted cargo could not decide where it belonged. 2 insertion corridors opened into incompatible destination states and tore themselves down. The foundry did not explode in a cinematic way. It lost agreement. For a transport civilization, that was worse. The surrender vessel over Earth went silent 14 minutes later. Publicly, what followed was described as a preemptive strike against an alien command platform. That version is clean enough for parades and schoolbooks. The operative truth is less flattering and more useful. We did not win because humans were stronger or purer. We won because a species that trusted common reference frames met a species that could deliberately live without them for 3 weeks and still move enough food, medicine, and steel to conduct a war. Our great advantage turned out to be tolerance for badly matched systems, local improvisation, handwritten workarounds, and people who kept going after the software stopped agreeing with itself. Lena eventually forgave me in the limited, practical way adults sometimes forgive each other after a crisis that left no clean options. Amira got her patches. Director Dube stayed at the port and later testified against 3 ministries that tried to hide how heavily they had relied on the continuity stack after first contact. Ren became famous for 6 months, then unemployable for a year, then useful again when every major city on Earth needed new timing law. Commander Sato disappeared into the part of government where successful operations go when the official story cannot tolerate their mechanics. The mechanism did not disappear. There is now an international limit on cross-network civic synchronization. Ordinary people experience it as nuisance. Payment systems occasionally settle late. Freight trackers jump backwards. Consumer devices no longer agree perfectly on time unless you physically force them to. Hospital systems use layered exceptions and old-fashioned human sign-off. Those policies are presented as resilient standards. That is true, but incomplete. The real reason is that no one who saw the continuity stack work is willing to give any outside system a planet that lines up too cleanly. I still work in timing, although most of my job now involves keeping certain classes of infrastructure deliberately untidy. Every house I have lived in since the invasion has had one wall clock set 0.3 seconds fast and another 0.3 slow. It is not superstition. It is calibration discipline applied to domestic life. Lena says it makes the kitchen feel tense. She is right. 3 months after the foundry operation, I pulled a residual board from the old Mombasa continuity stack for forensic disposal. The device had no network path, no stable power, and no authority left in any civic system I know of. When I bridged its service pins, it displayed one pending route suggestion before the screen died. It was a clinic priority allocation for insulin cartridges. The order timestamp was 19 minutes in the future.